Hello. Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone here. Can you hear me in the back? All right, awesome. I am Jennifer Johnston. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Nashville Studies. I'm just so pleased that everyone is here today. It's going to be a great discussion. I'd like to ask everybody to join me in opening your bag of chips. All right, anybody else? Anything crinkly? Go ahead and take care of that. Awesome. All the rustling? Okay, good, good. I'm so pleased so many of you made the time to be here today. This is a great opportunity to hear from researchers who have devoted their careers to education. At the same time, each of these people are deeply engaged with schools in Nashville and in other schools throughout the country. I'm excited to bring this level of knowledge and experience downtown to you. I want to thank the Public Library for co-sponsoring this event, providing the space and the great sound, the great space. This is a wonderful opportunity to engage in around the issue of vital importance to the future of our city. That nothing is more important to our city than the education of the next generation of leaders. This forum is an outgrowth of the mission of the Vanderbilt Center for Nashville Studies. Our mission is to connect thought leaders in the city with thought leaders at Vanderbilt around emerging issues of importance to the future of the city. No one has been more central to moving that vision forward than Steve Turner, who's here today, the president of Market Street Enterprises and one of Vanderbilt's most engaged alumni. Steve has served as the Vanderbilt Center for Nashville Studies Advisory Board Chair since its inception, and I'm grateful for his dedication to Vanderbilt and to the city. Thank you, Steve. We have several community advisory board members among us, including Ralph Schultz, President and CEO of the Nashville Chamber. We have several members of the Tennessee General Assembly with us. They're to be commended for spending time during this very busy legislative session, one that has been interrupted twice due to weather conditions, to gather with us to learn more about issues of vital importance to the future of our children. So I want to thank Representative John Ray Clements for being with us today, and also Senator Richard Briggs, who just drove in from Knoxville. I'd also like to acknowledge your District 18 Metro Council Representative Berkeley Allen. Thank you, Berkeley. And I haven't seen her yet, but Amy Frog, District 9 Metro School Board Representative, is on our list. Hi, Amy. Thank you. It's now my privilege to introduce Camilla Bimbo, the Patricia Rhodes Hart Dean of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. Peabody College is consistently among the top schools of education in the country, and that is due in no small part to the excellence of our leadership. Dean Bimbo is more than a leader, though. She is a scholar. She co-directs the study of mathematically precocious youth, longitudinal study examining the developmental trajectories of more than 5,000 individuals throughout their lifespan. She has a particular interest in identifying the educational experiences and interventions that are most conducive to developing intellectual talent and excellence in careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Dean Bimbo is a former member of the U.S. National Science Board and recently co-chaired the Commission on Standard and Performance Reporting that developed new accreditation standards for the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation. She's a trustee of Fisk University and former vice chair of the U.S. National Mathematics Advisory Panel. I'd like to welcome Dean Bimbo and this panel of outstanding Peabody faculty. Thank you, Dean Bimbo.
Well, first of all, thank you for that very kind introduction, but most of all, thank you, Jennifer, and to the Vanderbilt Center for Nashville Studies for organizing this event. What a turnout. I couldn't be more pleased. So, anyway, for those of you who don't know Peabody College, it is Vanderbilt's College of Education and Human Development, and we've been part of Vanderbilt since 1979, but have been known for many years for excellence in teacher preparation. We are also known for authoritative research into school choice, performance incentives, school and superintendent leadership, early childhood education, learning disabilities, and special education. And most recently, we launched the nation's first doctoral program in educational neuroscience. Now, Peabody draws faculty and students from a national pool of talent, not just locally, and it makes us happy that many of our graduates choose to remain in Nashville and Middle Tennessee to pursue their careers. And one Peabody alumna, Candace McQueen, is Tennessee's new Commissioner of Education. Couldn't help but brag about that. We're very pleased. Anyway, today's panel includes experts in math and science education, as well as teacher preparation and certification. I'm happy that Carol Johnson, a former superintendent of the Boston Public Schools, who has been a visiting professor at Peabody, can be here today to lend her perspective as a school leader. I don't have to tell you that standards and testing are two of the thorniest challenges in education, not only here in Tennessee, but across the nation. As with any controversial topic, it can be hard to separate the rhetoric from reality, but we hope to do so today, at least a little bit. It is certainly true that the role of testing has grown in students' lives, but it has also grown in the lives of teachers, schools, and even schools of education, as policymakers and educators try to use data to improve not only achievement, but accountability. It is fair to ask, as Commissioner McQueen is doing, how much testing is appropriate, and how large a role we want assessment to play in the educational lives of our children and schools. Standards are another polarizing topic. But what do we mean when we use the word standards? How do standards differ from curriculum? In the 21st century, we do have to know not only what other states are teaching, but what other countries are teaching if we want our children to be successful. Education is local, but it's also global. We won't resolve either of these challenges today, but we hope to throw a little light on them. And finally, one of Peabody's most important roles is to disseminate knowledge that's relevant to decision makers and stakeholders. We want to improve understanding and elevate dialogue. I hope you'll think of Peabody as an honest broker of knowledge and a resource of expertise. Now, after this introduction, I want to turn the podium over to Rogers Hall to introduce panelists and moderate the first part of our program. Rogers is chair of Peabody's Department of Teaching and Learning and a longtime researcher and innovator in the learning and teaching of mathematics. Thank you and enjoy.
I'm going to try and stay here. I'm hoping that you can hear me. Sounds like you can. My name's Rogers Hall, chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning, and I'm really happy to be here with an amazing set of colleagues today, and thank you for coming out. Thanks to the library for having us here. I want to introduce each of them, and I thought I would give each a chance to say, talk about 2 or 3 things that they think are left out of the current debate on standards and testing. And we'll do that before we get to a set of more specific questions. And so since I'm first up, let me just say that I'm here today to think with you and talk about what kind of learning we value. I think that's very important and often left out of these discussions. And also to give you some things to think about in terms of when and where that learning happens. It doesn't only happen in schools. I'm very interested in that as well. Let me get to the introductions. Carol Johnson is a visiting professor in leadership policy and organizations. She was in 2014 a Harvard Advanced Leadership Fellow, and she also serves on the board of the Spencer Foundation. She has served in leadership roles in districts across the country, most recently in the Boston Public Schools. And she's a graduate of Fisk University right here in the original Music City, and has a master's and PhD degrees from the University of Minnesota. And I thought I would give you a chance to talk a little bit about what you think has been left out. Now, just briefly.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I think there are a few things that I do want to stress. First, while I think we've established a framework for the standards, the students who are most likely to be challenged, whether they're students with special needs or students who are learning English for the first time or students who've lived in concentrations of poverty, I don't think that we've totally scaffolded out what it's really going to take to get those students to achieve at high levels. And so I think teachers want to do a good job. They want to implement the standards, but it's not enough to just say, put more kids in AP or put more kids to achieve at high standards without some careful thought about how one would scaffold learning opportunities and experiences for those children who are most likely not to achieve at high levels. And we know which students those are because we have a considerable amount of data about the access and achievement gaps that exist. Secondly, I think that it's important to understand how teachers learn. And Carrie Leanna from the University of Pittsburgh has done some work about the missing link in school reform and notes that teachers actually depend more on other teachers than they do on their principal, than they do on expert content people from the central office. And given that fact, we have to really be thinking about what conditions we create for that teacher learning and that shared experience to take place. I've taught in schools where all the fourth grade teachers shut their doors, never came out, and we never really talked much about what we were doing. And I've taught in schools where all the fourth grade teachers worked together as a team. We mapped out what we were going to do for the entire year, and we had a lot of reiterative processes in place so that we could attend to the individual needs of students. And so I would just say that part of really careful and thoughtful implementation of the standards and using assessments does really require more time for teachers to have that reiterative conversation, that opportunity to learn to become more proficient. Most recently, when I talked to a teacher and I asked the question, how do you think about implementing Common Core standards? And what, and this is a second grade teacher, so she's not really overly burdened with maybe the kind of testing, although in her district they do test second graders. And she said, well, you know, I go on the web and I go to Teachers Pay Teachers, and they've got all kinds of lesson plans there for you based on the standard that I'm working on that week. Some of the lessons are free, some of them I have to pay for, sometimes you can get a sheet, sometimes you can get a packet. So I also think that how this next generation of teachers are thinking about their learning is a very different and much more complex set of work. And we have to also just think about how we can maximize that social media interchange that's taking place naturally with where teachers are pretty much initiating, because what we don't know is would the quality of those lessons be what we view as highly real highly quality work for the kinds of instruction that we're trying to endorse. And just finally, and I'll say this real quickly, I think that we have too often worked in isolation, the research community, the policy community, and the practitioners. And I believe that it's very important as we move forward for the research community to be on the front end of this work, because I feel like too often we proceed unburdened by any evidence, and then we create these great policies that really there is some evidence of what might work, but we as practitioners are not paying attention to that evidence, and our policymakers sometimes are influenced by other political issues of the day. So I think that a real shift for this conversation would be to think about how to bring the research community on board earlier on. And I know from firsthand experience that when we tried to transform the work that we were doing with our English language learners, we made a decision to bring in the research community to really document the work we were doing. And it made a world of difference in terms of our ability to shift and change and alter the direction and to be more flexible and adaptable in the work that we were trying to carry out. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Our next panelist is Barb Stingl. Barb is a professor of the practice in teaching and learning. She's also an associate chair for teacher education in that department with me. She's the director of secondary education for us and co-director of teaching and learning in urban schools, which is a master's program that's a collaboration with MNPS. So Barb does basically everything for us. She is a fellow and past president of the Philosophy of Education Society and an executive board member of the John Dewey Society. She's a graduate of Bucknell University and has master's and PhD degrees from the University of Pittsburgh. Barb.
So this is what I was going to say at the beginning. I have spent almost 40 years educating young people. And I am a philosopher of education, an odd duck. But that means that I'm someone educated to ask prior questions, to challenge logics, and to skewer assumptions, my own and other people's. And I spend my days practicing both these crafts, educating and philosophizing. When I think about today's public debates about standards and testing, the thing that seems to be missing to me is a lively and vital discussion of why we are educating at all and what we hope our educational system will achieve for our young people and for the communities they inhabit. We are not asking the prior question of purpose, I think. We assume that schools serve narrow economic purposes, qualifying and credentializing young people, and of course schools do that. But we fail to articulate the important other purposes, building community through effective communication and aesthetic appreciation, invigorating the body politic by appreciating both that which is common in our heritage and history, and perspectives on that heritage and history other than our own, and developing the visions and talents of the blessedly diverse human beings who come to us for personal development. So for my money, the thing that's missing is this continuous asking and answering of the question of purpose. What do we want of schooling, no matter what its form? I think we want graduates who are both good and smart. We want them to be smart enough to think through the problems of the day, but we also want them to be good partners, good parents, good neighbors, good sons and daughters, good workers, good inventors, good at whatever the universe is calling them to do to contribute to our shared community. We want them to be responsive, and we want them to be responsible. So the question for me is, are the standards, whether we're talking about Common Core or Tennessee particular standards, are they advancing this broad agenda? Does the current regime of high-stakes testing contribute to making our students both good and smart? It's not even clear that test scores are going up, let alone that our children are smarter than we were. Well, mine are, but I don't know about yours. We have to keep asking these broader questions of purpose as we reconsider Common Core, as we develop 10 ready tests, as we determine how student test scores can be applied to teacher performance when the tests themselves are untested. My answer to this question about standards and testing and whether they're making kids both good and smart is, not surprisingly, mixed. Standards are useful to professional educators to ensure that we aim for a common end in view, but they can be and become a straitjacket, bewitching our intellect and our attention and narrowing our goals. Test scores across states, schools, or classrooms can shine a light on disparities, which has been the great positive outcome of No Child Left Behind. But even if those test scores were really reliable, they would never tell us how to solve the problems that we have identified. Test scores tell us where to look, what to interrogate, but they don't solve problems. That takes the intelligence and the experience of educators and the help of researchers, as Carol mentioned, and yes, policymakers and funders and all the people in this room. In a wonderful essay on habit in the late 1800s, the American psychologist and philosopher William James noted that most of us grow more and more enslaved to the stock conceptions with which we have once become familiar. That's what I think has happened in the conversation on standards and testing. We are enslaved to stock views, the dominant rhetorical trope that American schools are failing because they are not preparing students for the skills demanded in the world of work, and that they will be prepared if only they get higher test scores. We who educate and create the educational system with our policies are failing some students in some ways. I hope this conversation will uncover more about who we are failing and how and which standards and how and which tests might help us to educate all our students to be both smart and good.
Thanks, Barb. Our next panelist is Marci Singer. Marci is currently the Chief Academic Officer for Project Grad USA, a program for enhancing college access for public schools in low-income areas. They presently serve over 200 K-12 schools across the country. She is also a professor of the practice in teaching and learning and on leave, and we really hope she comes back to us next year. Marci is also co-developer with Stanford University faculty of the Education Teacher Performance Assessment System, which we use with our new teachers and is used across the state of Tennessee and the nation. Dr. Singer-Gabella is a graduate of Harvard University and has an MED from Columbia and a PhD from Stanford University. Marci.
Thank you. It is always really hard to follow Barb. But like many other people in this room, I think I come to this question wearing multiple hats. I am a mother of teenagers who are forging their intellectual, social, and civic identities, and I think that what happens with that is really important because they, like your children, will be running the world someday. As a teacher educator, and also as someone who's working closely with schools in Tennessee and Massachusetts, two very different contexts, although in both cases people are struggling with many of the very same issues about how to serve students well who have historically been not served well. I want to point out this background because while we will get passionate about math and English language arts in the next hour or less, it's really important, I think, as Barb and Carol have mentioned, that these standards represent a limited piece of the intellectual pie, and not to mention of the broader set of aspirations that we hold for children and youth. So for now, into the pot of what's missing from the debate, I want to add recognition of the origins of the Common Core state standards. So, for example, the math standards are the result of 3 decades of work by practitioners, researchers, and their professional organizations in the US and around the world about thinking about questions of how students develop mathematical understanding and skill, the nature of mathematics, as applied in the real world, as applied in math and social sciences, and math is applied in ordinary life, and in fact, mathematics as a field of study unto its own. I think that they, like the English language arts standards, represent a measured middle ground, highlighting the need for deep conceptual understanding in the case of math, and the need to learn and apply algorithms efficiently and correctly. So rather than asking how or whether we should be recreating that wheel that is forged again on more than 3 decades of work, I want us to be asking and chipping away at the questions that Carol raised at the beginning, at the question of what is the solution? How do we build a system of schools and partners that enable all students to achieve or exceed the sophisticated understandings and skills that are represented in standards like the Common Core state standards? Tennessee's educators and leaders actually in recent years began to chip away at this very question. And I think that real progress around using standards or any of our other levers for educational reform is going to hinge on our continuing to plug away at this incredibly thorny and challenging question. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Marci.
Thanks.
Next on the panel is Rich Lehrer, professor and Frank Maybourne Chair in Teaching and Learning. He's also a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. And I think interestingly for our purposes today, he's a committee member and author on National Academy of Sciences reports on assessment, integrated STEM education, and K-12 engineering education. Rich is a graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and has MS and PhD degrees from the University of New York at Albany. Rich.
Thank you, Rogers. Well, my perspective is informed both by the National Academy panels that I had the privilege to serve on, but also many years of work in classrooms with teachers and children. And from my perspective, there are two major things that are missing from this conversation. First, somehow assessment has been equated with testing. And I think that's very far from a modern image of assessment. And the second issue, I think, is that teachers and students are largely being left out of this conversation. Standards do serve productive purposes, particularly Common Core and Next Generation Science standards, because they emphasize that we need to find ways to have students participate in the generation of knowledge in areas like mathematics and science, and not just always be on the receiving end. And standards are a spur to do that, but we also have to think very seriously and appreciate the complexities of knitting the standards to create coherent instruction and to create coherent ways of generating evidence about student learning. And I'll say more about that at a later point in this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. I also want to introduce Katherine Gavin Los, who's sitting over at one of the tables here, but will be with us in a second. She's going to be handling questions and answers from the audience, and someone apparently is using Twitter to do this. I'm glad it's not me. Katherine is an assistant professor of practice in leadership, policy, and organization. She also coordinates their MPP and EDD programs. She has particular expertise in the area of history and politics of educational reform, and I think one of the things that she and I have spoken about that she would contribute if she were up on the panel at the moment is that this is a familiar story. We've had standards play out like this before, and so the arc of politics around this is not entirely new to us. Katherine is a graduate of Purdue University, has an MA from the University of Chicago, and a PhD from the University of Virginia. So as we met to try and think about how we would speak on this panel, we came up with a series of questions. And these are those questions, and I thought that we really had a pretty lively conversation about that.
And before you start on those, if anybody has any additional questions they would like to bring forward, bring them to me, or we have a box over here. Then when we get to that next part, we've collected a few, but if you have any other burning questions, bring them to us.
Yeah. So we were going to work through some of these questions, and I'm going to invite members of the panel to address each one of them. The first question is, how are standards and curriculum different? And I thought Marci might talk to us about this.
Okay. There we go. So standards fairly simply articulate a target. What are students expected to know and be able to do at a given point in time? Well-written standards make this abundantly clear, not only to teachers, but also to students and parents and other stakeholders, allowing us to understand, again, what does it look like when someone is proficient? So I want to take an example from the Common Core English Language Arts standards and the increased evidence, thank you, on informational text has gotten a lot of attention in the standards, and so I've pulled a standard that's related to informational text. This is the anchor standard for reading informational text. It appears at every grade level with increasing sophistication as you move up the grades. So the anchor standard, for those of you in the back, is delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, including the validity of the reasoning as well as the relevancy and sufficiency of the evidence. So what does that look like at first grade? By the end of first grade, we would like a student to be able to identify the reasons an author gives to support points of view, or to support points in a text. 5 years later, a little bit more sophisticated. By the end of sixth grade, we want students to trace and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, distinguishing claims that are supported by reasoning and evidence from claims that are not. Okay? Curriculum comes from, when in Curriculum 101, people usually hear something like, it comes from the Latin, which translates roughly as the course to be run. Commonly, curriculum refers to a planned sequence of experiences, the daily activities and material, and instructional supports that students encounter. And so a simple way of thinking about the difference between standards and curriculum is that if standards kind of tell us where students should get, curriculum is the path to getting there. And this is a graphic is courtesy of the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Lots of people have thought about this question. So when curriculum is intentionally aligned to intentionally designed to scaffold students' learning to meet particular standards, then educators claim that curriculum is aligned with standards. And there are a whole lot of people out there in the publishing world who are claiming that their curriculum aligns with standards. And so the question then, it behooves the teachers and others out there to kind of check, well, is that really the case? But when often curriculum is not quite so linear as that graphic would describe, and in fact, it might look something like one of these two pictures. But I want to point out that even when the path becomes much more complex and rich, what it looks like to achieve success, to achieve the standard, need not be. We know what it means to get to the top of the mountain. We know what that looks like. And we also know what it means when you've finished one of those courses. And then the final point that I want to make is that standards in this context are set as proficiency, what every student should get to by the time you've encountered, engaged with the curriculum. But that is not the ceiling. So standards set a target. They help us see what Barb referenced before as the end in view, but that is not the last point of the journey.
You advance to the next.
Okay.
Well, this is just a geographic image of where standards are currently.
Yeah.
You might want to hand it to Rich.
Okay.
Yeah? So the next question that we thought we would address is what are the possibilities and limitations of assessment? Rich has said some things about this already. Go ahead, Rich. Yeah, there you go.
So forward.
Okay. All right, thank you. Well, the first thing that I'd like us to think about is this is from an NRC report in 2001, and it tries to clarify that what we mean by assessment is fundamentally generating evidence. And the evidence, the trail of evidence is informed by how we think about learning, how we set up conditions for observation, and then we have to make inferences about what students know and can do from these observations. So we're always making inference, and we're always seeking ways of generating evidence of student learning. And the reason we're doing so is that we would like to improve the quality of instruction. So I'm taking just a small example from a third grade classroom where students are in a social studies lesson, and the teacher is boundary crossing into science and mathematics. And what they're studying is one of the standards, some notion about how organisms grow and their life cycles. What they're studying are silkworms and their important role historically and commercially. And what the standards also specify is that the ways in which students will get to understand these ideas is by participating in practices like carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, and the like. And in this case, students decided to try to measure the length of these critters as they were growing. They also took some measures of circumference of the critters, fatness they called it, but that didn't work out so well. It was tough on the critters. So after that, they collected these data. The teacher just said, well, you've all noticed things about these collections of organisms. They've been growing in the classroom for a number of days. So I'd like you to invent a display that shows something that you've noticed about them. So, of course, there were a variety of solutions. The one on the left, you'll notice the little oval. That's these students' attempt to remind us that these are larvae. And the length in millimeters of each of the larvae is represented. So it focuses on cases. The one in the middle has the innovation of grouping the measurements and counting them. And the one all the way on the right has the innovation of using the measurement scale so you can see gaps and holes in the distribution that otherwise you couldn't see. So this is a form of ongoing assessment. How are students thinking? But if that's all we were doing, of course, that wouldn't be sufficient. We have to tie this, we have to get behind the standards, and this is what we call a construct map. It's just a representation of the kinds of things that we value, and it's informed by research about how students typically reason, at least initially, about ideas about data visualization. So each of those solutions that students generated, we can locate with some representation of what is worth thinking about when we think about data visualization. So that positions us to have a classroom conversation. And my colleague Rogers likes to refer to this as developing representational competencies. And here we can just have a very simple conversation about what do these different solutions show and hide about the data. And ultimately, in this classroom, the solution that included the measurement scale provoked a new question. And the new question was, why are the tails of this distribution, why are they so sparse? And that led to ideas about, well, maybe the timing of the hatching is different, and so some organisms have a competitive advantage. And these are all 8-year-old children, so I thought this was a pretty good use of assessment. Now, if you insisted on creating a test, then we would hold you to we need to hold ourselves to the same standard. We have to not know that we're somehow or other testing math competencies, but we ought to be able to say what different student responses indicate about that mathematics competency. Now, notice that the advantage in developing a test is that everyone's responding to the same solution. But the disadvantage, of course, is that it's not as well grounded and situated in children's inquiry. So there's less of a purpose for it. So I'm just going to suggest that since learning is continuous, so should evidence of learning also be continuous. And that if we want to, as we do in the standards documents, engage children and older students in the production of mathematics and science knowledge, then there are very severe limitations of simple one-time tests to do that. So we're going to have to broaden what we think about as assessment.
Thanks, Rich. Can I get the controls back?
Coming your way.
It's coming your way.
Great. So one of our questions was, how should research on learning shape testing and standards? And I agreed to at least start talking about that. I wanted to begin with some forehead-slapping initial observations that probably don't require research, and these include people sometimes learn about things they do a lot. This doesn't mean that people understand those things very deeply. And people learn very little about things that they are not doing. So we should be deliberate about what we set out to teach. high-quality content, persistent access to it, and activities that foster depth are very, very important. This is an image that has circulated in the learning sciences research community for about a decade now. It describes a course of learning that leads to different kinds of expertise. Intensive practice of basic skills tends to produce routine expertise. You can rapidly solve a narrow range of problems very quickly and efficiently, usually accurately. Adaptive experts are more flexible. They find innovative solutions to non-routine problems, and they continue to improve with experience across the lifespan. If we never ask learners to grapple with non-routine problems that have multiple solutions, or to invent innovative ways to solve these problems, as Rich was showing us a moment ago, they're not likely to become adaptive experts. We want more adaptive experts in our society. We need them. They may not always do what they're told. This is a wonderful piece of research by Avi Riesman called Reading Like a Historian. If you have very good eyesight and peer at the abstract, you'll notice that 11th graders who received this kind of instruction did better in historical thinking, transfer of historical ideas to contemporary issues, mastery of facts, and even reading comprehension by very basic standard assessments by participating in this kind of a curriculum. This is just a huge success in the learning sciences literature on learning about history. The setup is pretty simple. Ask a good question, give some background, provide original historical texts, and talk about it in class. Do this for 6 months. Even with variable teaching fidelity, not all the teachers were fantastic at doing this, and you get these kind of results. 260 or so kids in the Bay Area of California is where the results came from. We could try this at a bigger scale. Let's see here. This is another wonderful recent piece of research, and it's done by a student that Rich supervised along with Leona Schabel, and she's a child to us all. We love Eve Mance. She's actually going to be here this weekend. So this is a recent study of third graders in a single intact classroom in Nashville, learning about ecology by modeling an area at their school that was not mowed. The innovation here was getting the staff not to mow the grass just outside their classroom. Students begin to notice relations between the schoolyard and their own gardens and yards at home. Once seeds are noticed, there's an explosion of student talk about how plants reproduce. Seeds will fasten to your socks and travel to new areas, students discover. As the weather deteriorates, we all know that story recently, models of the yard are built and maintained in the classroom using flats of plants. The material environment is simple enough, not particularly expensive, but the depth of student thinking over time is really impressive in this case study. The teacher is learning as much as are her students. There's the wild backyard where wild plants grow and humans don't mow. Finally, I want to introduce some ideas about where learning happens and when it happens. There's been a MacArthur-funded study that ran for multiple years looking at how youth use digital media and social media sites to support their own learning and develop new interests. This work was led by Mimi Ito and others, mostly out on the West Coast, as part of the MacArthur Foundation Digital Media and Learning Project. Youth do not, hopefully, ever learn only in school classrooms. Youth digital culture and connectivity through social media platforms has changed when and how children learn dramatically. Studies of connected learning show different intensities over time, and I'll just, they have some monikers for this that I think are useful for thinking. First, kids hang out. They notice what their peers are doing and develop new interests by perusing websites or hanging out with their peers. Second, kids more intensively begin to mess around, trying to make things, pursuing interests, trying tools for the first time that they find online. And some kids, for particular interests that they have, begin to geek out, using the internet to access communities with deeper understanding, skills, and tools. Whoops, excuse me. Not very readable, but these are some of the dimensions of connected learning that they argue we can design for. And I would see these as supplements to the kinds of curricula that would allow us to achieve Common Core standards and forms of assessment. Would want to be attentive to this as well. And I just want to end by saying the usual rules of engagement here still apply. Don't send an assessment to do the job of a curriculum. Don't send a curriculum to do the job of highly capable teaching staff. And maybe a new idea, don't assume that all learning happens inside the building. Our next question, what are the links among poverty, education, and achievement in urban settings? I thought I would invite Carol to speak to that.
So there's a plethora of research that connects outcomes for students and poverty. The most recent book and research has been done with the editing work of Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane in a book called Withering Opportunity, where they examine the gaps between rich and poor families over the last 30 years. And pretty much conclude that when you look at specific factors, for example, the average adjusted income for poor families is not really that much different than it was in 1977, where the average adjusted income for the more affluent families, the top 20% rose by more than a third. Sean Reardon has done some work in looking at the gap between low and high achievers on the SAT. And in 1978, the gap between poor and low-income families was 96 points, and it's grown to 131 points. College completion rates show that from 1970 to the 1990s, there's a 21% higher points, 21 percentage point higher for college completion rates for more affluent families, and poor families only had like a 4% increase. There is also a fair amount of work around poverty and issues of mobility. The issue of parents' ability to supplement learning has also been raised in Withering Opportunities, so that in the 70s, there was a $2,700 gap between what poor families provided in additional enrichment activities. So poor families were somewhere close to $800, and more affluent families were spending about $3,500. In some 30 years later, poor families are spending about $1,300, and affluent families are spending almost $9,000. The kinds of services that they're purchasing are things like music lessons, travel, summer camps, but it does create a differential access and explain some of the gap. The next area of looking at these issues, the link between achievement and poverty, is time. Time spent in novel places, time spent in places other than home or child care. Between birth and age 60, higher income families have spent 1,300 more hours in novel contexts than low-income families have spent. So novel contexts have to do with summer travel, going on vacations, going to museums and places that poor families tend not to participate in as much. There are also huge issues related to economic instability and insecurity. So there's a fair amount of research about the fact that students whose families live in persistent poverty also have increased experiences with trauma and stress. And where this persists over time, it has a physiological impact on brain and educational development. And this is certainly much more prevalent for students that live in poverty. The next area, other than sort of this discretionary income capacity piece, the ability to provide more time and support, is the increased racial and economic segregation. And it has increased substantially during the 1980s. And so more low-income kids are more likely to have classmates with low achievement and behavior problems, and also are more likely to be sorted into neighborhoods with low income. The other piece, which I think piggybacks a little bit on Roger's comment, is about peer effects and the fact that when you have lots of kids that are highly mobile, it reduces the time on task in classrooms as teachers have to accommodate new arrivals. And this is much more prevalent in the traditional public schools, who may not fill up at the beginning of the year, than it is, let's say, in charters or private schools where almost all the seats are taken at the beginning. And so they're taking in new kids all the time, is less prevalent. Now, there is a study by a Vanderbilt researcher in 2003 that suggests that traditional public schools need to look at models like the military, where Department of Defense schools routinely create transition supports for kids who are transitioning a great deal, and that those supports actually ameliorate some of the trauma of being highly mobile. But a lot of the research on mobility suggests that is consistently associated with lower achievement and higher rates of dropout when kids have significant disruptions in their instructional program. And then finally, teaching quality. Students who attend schools where there are higher concentrations of poverty tend to have weaker academic programs. There are big test score differences. College enrollment and graduation rates are much larger than they were 30 years ago. And I think that the other thing I guess I want to emphasize in talking to teachers, teachers are much more reluctant to want to work in a school with high poverty and high concentrations of poverty in an environment where the accountability consequences are so severe that you might lose your job or you might not be rewarded if you happen to be teaching in a school where you can predict that the outcomes for kids will be lower. And secondly, I think, even before we started teaching grades 3 through 9, testing grades 3 through 9, we used to test 3, 5, and 8. And as a building principal, I can tell you, I had teachers come and say, can I teach 2nd or 4th grade this year? And that's because if you think that the accountability is going to be more strident at the grade you're teaching, an unintended consequence is that teachers want to avoid those grades. The other part of it is, an unintended consequence, is that schools are more likely to reject or kick out kids who they view as having a negative consequence on their overall test performance. And those are the very kids that we need to make sure that they're in high-quality classrooms with high-quality teaching experiences. So this interplay between poverty and achievement, the persistent achievement gaps that are parallel to the persistent income gaps that are growing, present, I think, particular challenges to the work that we have to do to get all students to achieve at high standards and high levels of performance.
Thank you, Carol. Our final question, the questions we came up with, is what is the role of standards in guiding good instruction? I want to hand that to Barb.
So I don't know about you, but I am chewing on all the things that Rich and Marci and Rogers and Carol have said. Because I think, so Rich is raising this question of whether assessment and testing are the same thing, and you can pretty clearly see that he doesn't really think that testing, as we now use the term, is what we need to be doing in terms of assessing or understanding what kids are learning and how they're developing. Marci's pointing out that we have a curriculum and we need a curriculum, but there is the curriculum that we say we're teaching, and then there's the curriculum we are actually teaching, what actually gets enacted in classrooms. And Rogers is telling us what we know about how people learn and how to get those people to adaptive expertise, and I doubt seriously that there's anybody in this room who's going to say that's not where we want to get people. But we start with all these different people, and they're different not just in the ways that Carol has really articulated with respect to poverty in particular, but with respect to race, gender, national origin, religion, family structure, and onward. And so I'm the teacher, and I know this stuff. I actually do kind of know it, but somebody presents me with standards. And to be honest with you, I personally am a fan of national, not federal, but national standards. I think it's a good idea that we have a statement of what we think every kid in the country ought to know and be able to do. I'm not sure, I'm not making a brief for the Common Core, but I am saying it would be good to have standards like that, and here's why I want to say that. Number one, I live in my own corner of the world, and I tend to put my corner of the world in the center of the universe. Stated standards take me out of my corner, my community, even my state, and remind me what kids out there in the wide world are doing. I know if my students are encountering the world with the same opportunities as other kids. So that's true if I'm teaching in Metro and I'm comparing to Williamson County, or it's true if I'm teaching in Williamson County and I'm comparing to children in Pennsylvania, where I most recently lived. We have a tendency to just think, yeah, what I'm doing here is the right thing to do. We need some way of checking that. And standards are a good way to do that. Secondly, standardizing is something we do in our own lives for the constructive purpose of cleaning out the weeds. We all do it. We all do it all the time. There are things we habitualize in our lives so that we don't have to think about it. It takes energy to think about having to make choices all the time, and making choices about standards really set a background of habitualization in order to open up a foreground of creativity for teachers. So if I know what my standards are, what my ends in view are, then I can actually keep in mind the possibilities of legitimate assessment, the way I can enliven a curriculum, the possibility of getting to the kinds of learners that Rogers is talking about, taking all the kids into account. I know that the standards have been vetted, in the case of Common Core, as Marci pointed out, vetted over a period of 30 years. And because I know they've been vetted, I can trust that this is what we think, at least for now. I can spend my time and energy focused on what is really important for teachers. Teaching, those of you in the room who have done teaching will resonate to this, I think. Teaching is intellectual design. I get to design the environment and the activities that will enable learning. It is relational interaction. I'm always making connections with whoever my students are, young or old. And it's also a performance art. And that doesn't mean you have to be a comedian. It only means that there is an art and a presence to being an effective teacher. If I have standards, they provide my end in view, and I can concentrate on my art and my relations and my design.
Thank you. Katherine is going to lead us with questions from the audience.
Thanks, Roger. Hi, everyone. we received many excellent questions for this portion of the program, which I think speaks to the great interest and importance of this topic. So perhaps that's a need for more forums of this kind. While we are unable to get to all of the submitted questions in the public Q&A, our panelists will be available after the forum ends to answer specific questions that we can't get to in the public Q&A. So with that, I think I'll start with our first question. In the interest of getting to as many questions as possible, I'll ask our panelists to keep their responses to about 3 minutes or less. So the first one is a question that is twofold. What should be, and I think I'll pose this to Rich to start us off, what should be the most important objectives of testing and assessment? And is teaching to the test necessarily a bad practice? So Rich, if you could pick that one
Okay,
up.
well, in my view, the most important function of assessment is the improvement of instruction. So if we're going to ask students to create responses to things, then there has to be something that both we and they can see, some value in doing so. So I would expect assessments to be opportunities for students to learn. And I'd want to see evidence of that. And if I couldn't see evidence of that, then I really wouldn't want to be giving the assessment. The second part of the question
Is
was?
teaching to the test
Teaching
necessarily
the
a bad
test.
practice?
Well, if the test is crafted around student learning, then in fact we're always trying to teach to the test if we have a broader view of what it means to test. So I think teaching to the test, depending upon the nature of the test, that could be a good thing. But as I typically see it in schools, it's an awful thing. Because what happens is students are drilled within an inch of their life, and they don't really develop understanding of the big ideas, at least in mathematics and science.
So here's what I would say to the latter part of that. We seldom question teaching to the test when it has to do with advanced placement courses. And advanced placement courses are clearly structured to cover a specific set of curriculum and content, and then for students to be able to perform at a certain level, to use that toward their college credit bearing future. And so I think that while learning has to be the ultimate objective, I think that we have to also examine in what ways we do overtly teach to the test and make assumptions that we never question.
I want to add one more small piece. In the sciences or in everyday life, when we talk about a test, we're talking about trying something out to see whether it's working and how it's working, and gathering data. And using the data to tweak or improve the system. So I think I'm underlining Rich's point. And in order to do that, in order to be able to see the data, we have to have assessments that actually make kids' thinking and reasoning visible. So, and then once that thinking and reasoning is visible, we can interpret it and figure out what does that mean for our next step. If tests constrain the thinking, if we are unable to see what is happening inside of the minds of students, then it's very difficult to know what I should be doing differently or tomorrow.
And I would just add to that the articulation of standards should be an opportunity to say this is what we most want, what we imagine our young people will be able to do when they graduate from high school or at the end of 9th grade or whatever. This is what we want them to be like. And can we create standards that express a richer sense of what we want them to be like? And then, of course, we would teach to that because that's our goal. That's the goal and the target that we're aiming for.
I just wanted to say that I think the technologies for online assessment of students are gearing up very rapidly, so this is probably a good time to ask the question, what do we want to assess and how do we want to do that? Because our students are going to be faced with end-of-course assessments that are a product that districts are purchasing, and that's coming very, very quickly.
Great. Another criticism that has emerged is, along with testing and standards, has been a narrowing of the curriculum. So we have a question from the audience that asks about the ways in which, because of Common Core's focus on math and English, where do the arts fit into the Common Core? Given what research tells us about children's exposure to arts and music and its contributions to student learning, what of the role of the arts and sort of non-tested subjects in this discussion? So I don't know, Carol has some experience with that, but I can open it up to others as well.
Well, I'm a strong advocate for the arts as key to, and I guess I would say there is certainly some research on arts connected to math and other things, but I think arts should stand on their own, and they don't necessarily have to be connected to the academic performance on assessments. I think that if you read some of the work by Daniel Pink, he suggests that the jobs of the future are really going to require design and creativity to a greater level than we've had before. And so if young people, and I think Roger's diagrams certainly articulates this very well, if they never have these other abstract and creative opportunities to express themselves, they will be long-term very short-changed in their ability to do well. In some of the turnaround schools in Boston that I've worked with, I had principals who traded in all of their security positions and hall monitors and bought music and dance and visual arts teachers. And we saw phenomenal results related to both reductions in suspensions, more improved attendance, and improved academic performance. And so I think that when it is well structured and integrated and provides connections to engage young people, it certainly is a high leverage strategy for improving performance in our lowest performing schools. You know, John Dewey said in 1901, what the best and wisest wants for their child, that we must want for all of America's children. The reality is the affluent families understand that the arts are a critical part of their children's education, and they don't hesitate to enroll them in music lessons and dance lessons and all the other creative experiences that enrich their children's lives.
I'd like to add to that we need to remember that standards have not been responsible for the removal of the arts from the school curriculum. The removal of the arts from the school curriculum has come as a result of much lower state support for public schools across the country, and at the same time, high-stakes testing that requires that schools, in order to stay open and or receive funding and or that they get high scores, better scores on only two kinds of tests. Now, I agree with Carol. There's actually a fair amount of literature out there that would suggest that providing kids with arts, both music and visual arts experiences, would actually help literacy and math scores. But we need courage. We need courage. We need superintendents and school directors with courage. We need principals with courage. We need individual teachers and teacher teams with courage to say, no, we are not abandoning the arts. The standards don't tell us to abandon the arts. They tell us what to do in the instruction in math and reading, and science as well. But that doesn't mean we take away the arts. It also doesn't mean we take away recess, right, Amy Frog? But yeah, it's not standards that are telling us that. It's a certain political and policy situation right now that has put such pressure on the folks making the decisions, and they have not had the courage or the knowledge or the wherewithal to stand up to those pressures. There's no reason why we can't have rich art programs in schools tomorrow if we will fund them and if we will support the principals who make the decisions to do that.
I will just add one thing. I think that we do have to examine how much time we're spent on testing and during the school day and how we're using the time we have. Because what does narrow the ability to do a lot more is if everything is focused on test prep and literacy and mathematics, without more time, it does crowd out the kinds of experiences that I do think we want for all of our children.
Great. Next question. Annual teacher evaluations and other high-stakes personnel decisions are increasingly tied to student test scores. Given what we know from the research, what are some of the problems this approach creates? What is missing from this debate? So I don't know if Barb or Marci want to take that up.
Sure. There are a couple of things that are important to know. One is that the American I'll pull from the American Statistical Association, which has argued fairly convincingly. This is an organization that represents the people who understand what we're doing when we calculate value-added metrics, when we try to draw a relationship between a student's performance on a test and the effectiveness of a teacher. And their conclusion, after looking at a number of studies, is that we cannot rely on we don't understand the impact of high-stakes testing on this system of performance that includes student performance and teacher performance, and that in fact there is so much noise in the system around testing that it is at our peril that we make consequential decisions based only on test scores. We do know that good systems of evaluation have multiple measures, and increasingly states are developing evaluation systems that rely on observation of teachers, samples of student work, the feedback that teachers give to student work, their participation and their collaboration with colleagues in creating rich, strong in-school support systems, both for teaching and for learning to teach, and then also to support student learning. So these are some of the pieces. One other useful bit of statistic that I think is there is that we often hear that teachers are the single largest in-school factor of student that accounts for the variation in student achievement, which simply means that some students do well on tests and some students don't. That number is somewhere between 7 and 13% of all of the things that shape what happens when students sit down to fill out answers on a standardized test. So we have a lot to understand about that bigger system, and we probably have some other levers to use when we want to improve achievement, but then we also need to really look very carefully at those multiple measures of teaching effectiveness in order to think about a good and credible system of teacher evaluation.
Great. Any others?
I just want to underscore what Marci said. The work of Raj Chetty at Harvard suggests that well over 2/3 of all of student achievement can be accounted for by things like poverty, location, etc. That means that when we think about what difference we are making in student, I don't want to just say achievement, because achievement is a code word for tests. When we think about the difference we're making in student development and student growth, as well as achievement, we're talking about perhaps 30%. And then when we look at all the possibilities, as Marci points out, the teacher, of that 30%, the teacher is 1/3 of that, or somewhere in the range of 10% of the overall impact. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be helping teachers become the very best they can, but I think we also have to understand that teachers are not, we are not looking for heroic teachers. We are not looking for supermen and women who can step into very difficult situations and make something of nothing. We can look for them, but we're not going to find them, not enough of them, and not the kinds of people that we need. So what we really have to be doing is figuring out how to structure education, especially in urban environments, but also in rural environments, in environments where we are dealing with many children that we might put in a high needs category of whatever kind. We've got to structure those settings so that there is support for people being heroic. We don't have to find heroes and bring them in. We have to create the structures that will support their heroism on a day-to-day basis. I often say urban teaching is a team sport, and I mean that sincerely, and I think we have to restructure schools in a way that that teaming, that support is there. I got a call from somebody at Metro a couple weeks ago who asked me, Barb, how do you measure grit when you are trying to figure out who the good teachers are going to be? And I just started laughing, and I said, well, we don't measure grit. That doesn't mean that I take just anybody. I mean, I'm looking for somebody, obviously. I'm looking for candidates that have persisted at things. I'm looking for candidates that have experienced some adversity. I'm looking for candidates who are not utterly egocentric. But our plan is to create the circumstances that provide the possibility of demonstrating grit. And I do want to say that about teachers generally, because when we talk about evaluating teachers, I would also like to evaluate the circumstances in which we put them, to ask us, the policymakers, the administrators, whoever, whether we are providing the circumstances that can make them successful.
If I could just piggyback on that, because I think Barbara makes a really good point, and it is about how teachers work together. There was a study done of 1,000 teachers across 130 schools in New York, fourth and fifth grade teachers who in mathematics. And they followed them to look at their one-year performance data. They controlled for attendance and poverty, and they also used a measure of figuring out the quality and ability of the teachers. I think that what they showed that teachers who work together in teams and work together were more likely, and who had frequent conversations with each other, had better performance. And even with the teachers who were less capable, I think the most striking thing was that their interactions when they were interacting with other teachers, regardless that the students outperformed those because they actually improved their performance by working together with other high-performing teachers. And so this notion of, I think we've really zeroed in a lot on the single teacher and improving the single teacher. And the problem with that is that it negates the collective power of teachers working together in teams and holding each other accountable, which the research shows is showing a lot more evidence that that's really being the high-level strategy for improving the overall performance in the schools when the teachers work together.
And just a quick follow-up, and there's a lot of value added when those conversations are centered around student thinking.
Great. And student work.
And student work.
I'm going to need to wrap up the public Q&A. We received many excellent questions around parent engagement, community engagement, and I certainly invite the audience members to come up and engage our panelists after the forum ends. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rogers to provide some synthetic and wrap-up comments for today's forum. So thanks to the panelists. Thanks for your excellent questions.
Thanks, and thanks you all for coming. Challenging task. I don't assume I'm going to do it tremendously well. I think that the takeaway for me today, and I hope that people are thinking about this as they leave this afternoon, is that we really want to pay attention to what we value in learning. The function of standards is to do that for us, to help us do that, wherever the standards are coming from. That's very important. The second thing to ask maybe ourselves is, who are assessments for? And what kind of information do they provide for what purpose? And I think we've heard great things today about that. And I think the third thing, maybe the final thing for me, is that we ought to talk to each other more. I think of Vanderbilt University as a resource for the city as well as for the nation, and I think these faculty are willing to talk to folks in the public, people in the schools. We're working intensively with many of you already, and I hope we get to talk more. Thank you.